Machicolations! So, here's the next stage of this war that's ongoing. No, it's not really a war, and I have to thank Shad for his most recent video upload on this topic. Absolutely fascinating stuff. Really good video, and I completely agree that there are numerous ways to pronounce things in English language, especially when we get into geographic differences, obviously between American and British or Australian or Kiwi or Canadian or whatever, but even within the British Isles. And that's a very, very good point that, in fact, a number of people commenting under my video and under Shad's as well have made, is that, there are different ways of pronouncing things in different parts of the British Isles, and indeed there were historically different ways of pronouncing the same word in different regions of France or different counties of England or whatever. And the reason I'm holding a helmet here is, what is this? Well, it's a helmet, but what type of helmet is it? Well, most of us would say it's a sallet, but I know that an awful lot of people, particularly people who followed Ian Laspina's channel, Knight Errant, get very annoyed and they say, Matt, why don't you call it a sallet? Well, I completely concede that in a lot of England, perhaps all of England in the 15th century, 16th century, this may possibly have been called a sallet. A sallet quite probably usually would have been called a sallet. Why do I therefore persist in calling it a sallet? Well, quite simply, and this comes back to Shad's point, it's about convention and about how language has evolved. And the fact is that most people who I've ever met in my life, and bearing in mind I've spent most of my teenage and adult life interested in armour and researching it and talking to people who are interested in this stuff, call this a sallet. So therefore, naturally, I'm going to call it a sallet, because if I refer to a sallet, then they're going to look at me weirdly and go, why is that guy calling it a sallet? Even though it might be historically correct. So therefore you might go, oh, but Matt, aren't you doing a U-turn here? Well, yes, I am a bit. And I'm going to shock you even further now. So, since my video of yesterday, where I obviously did some research regarding Machicolations or Machicolations, I refuse to call it Machicolations because I don't think anyone ever called them that. But if I call them Machicolations, as Shad does for the purposes of this video, when I came to research these things, so I came at it from the premise of it was a word of French origin, which it is. So there are some words we do pronounce in a French way, and there are some words that we don't pronounce in a French way, regardless of, even when they've got a French origin. Now, since filming my video yesterday, so when I filmed that, I could not find any medieval examples of the word machicolation, okay, or machicolation. And I couldn't find any examples in the English language of that being used until the 18th century, the 1700s. So therefore, in lieu, there's the use of a French word there, in lieu of that evidence, I decided to go, okay, well, let's go with the French pronunciation, in the assumption that the medieval English, at least nobility, would have pronounced machicolation as machicolation or machiculi or something like this, because they were speaking French, or at least by the 14th, 15th century, when the English nobility were now speaking predominantly English after Edward III's reign, by that point they still would have retained certain French affectation and pronunciation and things like this. But since then, I have discovered there is one, and I'm sure there are others if we look out there, but there is one so far that I have found, medieval, loosely, English source, which uses a term which is clearly related to machicolation. Now, what is this source? Well, the source is La Mort d'Arthur, which is ironically a French title, The Death of Arthur, by Thomas Mallory, published by Caxton in 1485. Now, it gets a little bit complicated at this point. So 1485 is medieval in standard, the way we teach medieval history in England. We usually class that pretty much as the end of the medieval period, but it's the end of the Wars of the Roses. The Battle of Bosworth was in 1485, and it's the junction between the end of the Plantagenets and the beginning of the Tudors. So for us, it's kind of the end of the medieval period and the beginning of the Tudor period, and that's where we kind of shift out, at least in England, from medieval to Renaissance. Understandably, outside of England, usually the Renaissance is classed as beginning much earlier than that. But anyway, it's the shift from Plantagenet to Tudor. That's the important thing. Now, in this period, they absolutely were still using castles as fortifications, and equally, they were still using French language, although they were also using English language. So English was now the official court language in England, but they were using French affectations, and as in Le Morte d'Arthur, they were still using French for the titles of books, for example. Even though the Arthurian legend is one of the British Isles, they still have this connection with French chivalry and French knightly culture. So what does this source actually say? In chapter 10 of the book, we find a description of how the third brother, called the Red Knight, jousted and fought against Beaumains, and how Beaumains overcame him. And it says, "So within a while they saw a tower as white as any snow, well matchacold all about and double dyked." So here we have a description of a tower, a fortification, and it says it was well matchacold. Now matchacold, interestingly, is the same root word as machicolation or machicolations. Okay, so it's the same root word, but notice that it is written matchacold with a T. Now, we have to caveat that with the point that Thomas Malory wrote a manuscript which Caxton apparently altered before publication, and this has been through a sort of mill of, I guess, a process, an editorial process. And we don't know precisely whether this is how Malory himself would have written it. Equally, we don't know if this is specific to a region. So we have to say, just because this one source writes it this way, it doesn't mean that all English people at this time would have said it this way or written it this way. We just don't know. And as Lloyd himself pointed out, Shakespeare spelt his own name numerous different ways, none of which I don't think were the way that we now spell William Shakespeare. But the point is that this is one English source from the 15th century that we have. We actually now have a source, and I didn't have one when I made my previous video. And what's interesting is it is spelled M-A-T. So matchacold, matchacold as in having machicolations. And this is quite significant because in the way of the spelling, it tells us how it was phonetically being spoken or said in the 15th century. And we can't argue with the fact that because of that letter T in there, it is very clearly matchacold or machicolation. So, in fact, Shad's right. It's machicolation, at least with this one 15th century English source that we have. Now, that's not to say, of course, that it shouldn't have been in the original French form, machiculi, or machicolation. It should have been something like that originally in French. But as we know, the English butchered French, or did they? And this is where the other complication comes in. So as various people commented underneath my previous video and have commented under Shad's videos as well, French pronunciation wasn't always the same in all of France and across all time. So modern French pronunciation is really a product of the 18th and 19th centuries. And in certain parts of France, they did pronounce the CH rather than a sh, a soft sh, as it would be in modern French. They did pronounce it with a harder ch sound. And it should perhaps come as no surprise that it is those dialects which influenced Anglo-Norman French in England. So with the English, we poor English often get accused for butchering the French language, but often what we really represent is actually the Anglo-Norman French Just because we don't represent modern French, well, that's not our fault, because we didn't have a direct connection to modern French when these French words came into English language. We had a connection to the language of the Plantagenets and the Angevins, and the you know, people like Geoffrey of Anjou and these sorts of people who were influential on the French language in England. We weren't being influenced, our use of French wasn't being influenced in the time of Napoleon or the you know, Third Republic or whatever. So, to cut a long story short, we now have at least one English source using, if not the word machicolation, the word matchacold, which is very clearly related to it and synonymous, you could almost say. We have this word, and we have it written in a phonetic way that tells us that in 15th century England, which is as far back as I've got so far in the English language, they were saying it with a ch sound, not a sh sound, and certainly not a k sound. I mean, that was always a crazy idea by Lloyd, but there we go. I'll let him answer to that point. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope this has been an interesting series for you. Thanks again to Shad for responding. Fascinating stuff about Crusader castles and pre-Crusader fortifications. That's something I'll definitely be looking more into myself. I hope that this series, I don't know, where will this lead us? What will we learn next about machicolations? Maybe we're all going to learn a lot more about machicolations than we ever thought was possible in the first place. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon for another video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.